A ghost dog guided me to the body of its owner who had disappeared 2 years before. Forest rangers, what are your unexplainable and downright creepy stories? I have so many of these, but I'll share my favorite. I have been a ranger in the USFS for almost 15 years, but this took place about 3 years after I joined. We were getting calls about a lone wolf with a collar on hanging around campsites. Weird, since wolves aren't known to be in the area, but when you work in the field long enough you start to realize anything is possible. No calls had mentioned violent behavior from the animal, thank God. I departed from the station around noon to check out the places where it had been sighted, wandered around for about 3 hours, no further calls during that time, until I took a break for water. I sat down, had a snack, drank some water, and was getting ready to go again when the thing was about 20 feet out, trotting near the tree line. It seemed friendly and had the collar, so I whistled to it and he came over to me. Getting a closer look, I could see it wasn't a wolf. It was huge, but it was dark and didn't have the right body structure, though I could see why it'd be confusing from a distance. I radioed in and reported that I had the dog with me, but as soon as I said I'd bring it in, the dog fucking took off. Like he was playing, to see how far he could get me to chase him, typical dog behavior. I went after it, and I swear it was a game of chase for at least 5 minutes as we steadily ran through the forest. Please don't go running through woods unless you know the area like the back of your hand. The dog finally slowed down near a rock bed/creek area and started pacing around a spot. I drew closer and didn't see anything off at first, but then I noticed it. The overgrowth had almost disguised what appeared to be bones. I called it in immediately, and another team was sent to recover the remains. When I went to retrieve the dog, he was just gone. But honestly, it wasn't a priority at that point. He was friendly enough, and I figured we'd catch up with him later. The bones were identified as a teenage male, who died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He'd been reported missing in the area long before I became a ranger, and there'd been pretty much no hope of finding him. I spoke to his mom on the phone. She called to thank me personally, and she asked how I'd found her son. I mentioned the black dog, then thought I'd said something wrong since there was a pause on her side of the line. After I gave a couple of details about the dog, she quietly explained that her son, who struggled with making connections, had sunken into a deep depression after the death of his best friend, the very dog that had led me to him. I think I spent the rest of the day stunned. I continue to be in disbelief, in a way. But I know what happened. I have a friend who is a trail ranger, basically, a ranger who can't get you in trouble. He told me about this time he was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking down hunting stands, feeders, and blinds with another actual ranger. The other ranger wasn't feeling well, so he said he was going to head back as it was a 1-hour ATV ride. My friend finished up the last one when he heard voices. Keep in mind he's far off the beaten path. He called out, and no one replied. As it was getting dark, he started to head back and found that his ATV wouldn't start. He then noticed that the battery was not connected anymore. He reconnected it and started to drive, but it wasn't going fast at all. Less than a half-mile later, the whole thing died. He radioed back, basically saying, "Hey guys, I need someone to come pick me up." They told him they would, but it would be an hour. He asked if the other guy got back, and they said no. He settled down and started a small fire, but before long, he heard voices again. It's dark, he's not happy. The voices sound like an argument now. Someone was angry and yelling at someone else who sounded more scared. He called out and asked if anyone needed help. The voices didn't seem to care. He guessed they had to be less than 1,000 feet away. He radioed again, and they said they were having trouble finding what path he might be on and hadn't left yet. He asked them just to get the other ranger to tell them about where they were because he left with the iPad that had the map. They said he still isn't back. About 3 more minutes go by, and he hears the voices start up again. He decides to walk to them, hoping maybe they can stop being drunk assholes and maybe have a map. He walked in their direction, but the voices seemed to be getting further as he got closer. Finally, after 20 minutes, he gave up and walked back. He got a radio call, and they said the other guy was found passed out covered in vomit and was being taken to the hospital, but he crossed off everywhere they found a stand so they had a general idea of where he was. Then the radio died. Then the voices came back. Bored out of his mind, he decided to listen to what they were arguing about, picking up things like, well, it wasn't yours to take, I don't fucking care, you knew better, and so on. His guess was two hunters arguing over a kill. Then he heard the one shout something unintelligible, then silence, then, bang, a gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that, he heard nothing, just his breathing for the next half hour until he saw ATV lights. He told the guy picking him up everything, and they called back. They had people looking for 3 hours and found nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour, a shallow grave was found, and in it was a long dead man who had clearly been shot in the face. The thing was, it was a skeleton who had been there for years. So either the argument he heard just ended with a bang, and both parties went home last night, or he heard the murder of someone from years ago. One of my best buds from college was a geologist major that ended up becoming a ranger in the southeast U.S. Haven't spoken in years, as is the case with age, but I remember about 8 to 9 years back he was telling me about an old married couple that he had recently helped out. He had seen them come to the park several days in a row and found out they were visiting from out west, and they had gotten engaged there decades prior. They had been searching for a spot they'd taken pics of where he popped the question but were having trouble. After looking at the pics and figuring out roughly where they were trying to get to, he escorted them in his vehicle, then hiked with them to where he thought it would be. They found it, and he left them there and went back to his station at the entrance. He said he got a weird feeling once he got back, and felt like he needed to wait to see them whenever they left. Well, once it came time to lock up at night he still hadn't seen them leave, so he reported it, left his assistant to wait at the shack at the entrance, and went back to where he left them. He found both of them lying down spooning along the bank of the river. Neither was alive. He called the cops, went through the 9 yards, and went home. The police were able to disclose to him their identities but weren't sure anything else initially. Later he learned that the wife was terminally ill with cancer, and they had both committed suicide by ingesting some sort of chemical/pill combination medley. They just chose to do it where they had gotten engaged. My bud wasn't torn up about it. He was obviously sad about them dying but said that he thought they hadn't asked for help earlier because they didn't want anyone to think they helped kill them. Not a ranger, but I lived on the outskirts of a national park in a cabin. It was a 4-mile drive from the main road just to get to the property, and we had no plumbing or power. This property was right next to where the park started. To call it the middle of nowhere is an understatement. My roommate at the time was interning with the park service, but he is a city kid. Every evening in the dead of night I had been hearing noises in the woods, what I thought was someone walking, but then they'd just stop in particularly overgrown areas of the jungle, so my mind started to doubt itself. Is it a pig? A cat? Is it just the wind? The cabin didn't have a locking door, and the owners didn't want me to install one, so I began sleeping in my car. Now, this is a huge property, and I'd park my car over an acre away from the cabin and where I was hearing something. I started hearing those footsteps again. I moved out. My roommate, who thought I was bonkers, stayed and still slept there without a locking door. He got robbed, not once, but twice after I moved out. So he finally put up motion-triggered cameras. There was a man with a long rifle who'd hike up to the property, set up in the bushes, and watch us. Not a ranger, but I was out camping with my dog one night along the Mogollon rim of Arizona. It was dark and we were sitting around the campfire when we heard something behind a bush close to our camp. Instead of my dog barking at it, he begins to whimper. I didn't think anything of it and just tended to the fire. After a couple of minutes, we heard some more noises from a different bush. This time my dog gets up and goes over to the tent and scratches the door because he wants to go in. I tossed a couple of rocks in the direction I heard the noise and nothing happened. I'm spooked now, so I toss a couple of pieces of wood on the fire and climb into my tent with my dog, hoping that the light from the fire would keep whatever was out there away. We eventually fell asleep and luckily had no other disturbances during the night. The next morning, I went out behind the bushes where we had heard the noises and found mountain lion tracks that were circling our camp. I'm glad I didn't go looking at night when I heard the noises. Not a ranger, but I used to be in a group that's somewhat like the Scouts, so we spent a lot of time in the woods and some weird shit happened often, but most of the time it was easy to explain. One thing happened though that to this day scares the living shit out of me. I was a leader for the age group 8 to 10 years old and we were out on a camping trip. It was the first year we stayed on that terrain and it was huge. Normally we tend to explore the majority of the terrain before the kids arrive, so we were aware of any possible dangerous spots to avoid. This time it was impossible. Every camp we have what we call a night game. It's usually a scary game in which the kids have to complete several tasks while the leaders scare the ever-loving shit out of them. Obviously, we had one too during that camp. We masked up as monsters and hid out in the woods close to the checkpoints they had to pass. While running in between checkpoints I found an open stretch of forest with little to no foliage, so it was ideal for chasing after them. There was no real room to hide besides behind trees, so I couldn't use my flashlight or they'd be able to see me from miles away. It was dark, like the unsettling kind of dark that plays tricks on your eyes and you start imagining things that aren't real. During my stay there I saw a shadow that was around my size running past me a few times. I couldn't see it very well, so I just assumed I was imagining things because nothing was there when I turned my flashlight on. The game was nearing its end and I saw the shadow again. This time I could see it vaguely standing near a tree not too far away from me. I thought it was one of the other leaders hiding to scare kids and decided to go over there as it was about time to go back. I aimed my flashlight towards the tree and while getting closer I noticed that there was indeed someone standing there dressed in what looked like a torn burlap sack and had their head covered with a few white plastic bags that looked like they were tied together. I started to feel pure dread. Something felt really off. I asked if everything was okay, but they didn't respond. The only thing I heard was this weird sound that sounded like someone knocking on wood. Nevertheless, I went a bit closer until I was about 10 meters away from this person. The knocking sound turned out to be that person smacking his head repeatedly into the tree, and I noticed he looked like a male. He was barefoot and his arms and legs were covered with crusted mud. His hands were in a weird cramped position. I was convinced this was just one of the other leaders pulling a prank, so I told them to knock it off. He slowly turned his head and started walking towards me. Something inside me just told me to run. It didn't matter if it was just a stupid prank, and I ran away scared for nothing. If this wasn't a prank, it felt like I was in serious danger, so I ran as fast as I could. I heard him running after me, but I didn't want to turn around to look as I'd probably run into a tree. I arrived back at the campsite and every single person that could be dressed like that was already there. They couldn't have gotten there before me, and if they did they sure as hell didn't have the time to change into their regular clothes. Still, I told them and that they gave me a good scare with that. They just looked weird at me, thinking I was trying to scare them, and we left it at that. The next day I wanted to go check it out. Who knows, maybe some weirdo ate the wrong mushroom and might be out there dying from hypothermia. I took someone else with me just in case, and there was nothing but endless trees. We arrived at the tree where I saw the person banging his head, and there was a dead, skinned, decomposing rabbit nailed to the tree. We called the cops, and they looked around quickly and brushed it off as just a prank from another scouting group or some kids from the nearby town and left it at that. We didn't notice anything weird after that, so it probably was a dumb prank, but seriously, some people have a fucked up sense of humor. Small chance I'm the cause of one ranger's story from about a decade or so ago. Was hunting public land with my dad, several miles from anything close to a trail. So the day goes by and not much is going on, weather is shitty and I'm not hearing distant gunshots, so I reckon the deer aren't moving much. I radio to the old man that I'm gonna head back, and we make plans to rendezvous where we had split up that morning. 20 or so minutes later, I was kneeling around the edge of a pond, stripping off all my bulky camo layers. I was just fucking around, putting stuff in my bag while I listened to my earphones. I can't remember if I had taken my blaze orange hat off or not to remove my pullover, but I had all the appropriate gear to denote myself as a hunter in my possession. As I was digging through my bag, I thought I heard that faint bass of someone yelling, so I took an earbud out and noticed that crouched on the opposite edge of the pond, there was a lone forest ranger kinda just watching me. I stood up but didn't wave, and I wasn't sure he had even yelled at me in the first place, so I didn't holler anything to him. We just kinda locked eyes for what felt like a few minutes. To be clear, we weren't doing anything illegal. My rifle was unloaded by that point, though slung over my shoulder, obscuring the fact the action was open, and we're following all laws and regulations. I hunched back over to my bag, pulled out my walkie, and radioed to my dad, "We've got company." My motives weren't nefarious, I just didn't want my dad to come bumbling down the hill and be surprised by a friendly law enforcement officer. When I looked back up, maybe 15 seconds later, that ranger was gone. I mean flat the fuck out gone. So eventually I meet back up with my dad and start to tell him about what happened. Yeah, as deep back in here as we are, he probably thought we were up to no good, and hit the trail when he saw you on a radio. They get ambushed like that. I was in the Gila wilderness and a convoy of us campers/fishers were making the drive on the dirt road from Mogollon to Snow Lake when we spotted a forest ranger guy pulled over looking in a ditch. Turns out some idiot tried to make a U-turn and didn't realize the loose rock makes it hard to stop. They went over the edge and high-centered. We're miles from the nearest official campground and it's early spring and the nighttime gets pretty damn cold. We get a jeep with a winch in position and start to pull the guy out of the ditch. Off a hill comes a white dude in a purple velvet sweatsuit. He's got a walking stick, a fanny pack, and the purple velvet sweatsuit, that's it. He's a blonde dude and pretty skinny. He comes up to us and he tells us he's German and having a great time. We could not get over the purple velvet suit, it was like a real pimp sweatsuit. The ranger is immediately suspicious, wants to know where's he staying and where he came from. It was around 9 o'clock in the morning and the only way he could have gotten where he came from was to hike for hours. The German guy is a goofy fuck and just points off toward the other mountain when asked where he's staying/going. We all think it's funny, but also question how the guy is getting along with no water and no food. The sun is intense above 5,000 feet even if it's only 75 degrees. The German guy refuses water or any other help and just crosses the road and goes off into the woods. The ranger told us he couldn't really keep the guy from doing that since he seemed okay. He said he'd check a few campsites in that direction later to see if he made it. We get to Snow Lake and commence drinking like fish in order to better catch fish. That evening the ranger popped by to tell us that nobody at any other camp had seen the dude. He radioed around and no other rangers had abandoned camps or missing campers and they surely hadn't seen a German dude in a purple pimp sweatsuit. That range rolled off duty the next day and his replacement came by to make sure the other ranger was smoking something we gave him. We assured him it all happened. Never heard another word about the German in the purple pimp sweatsuit, but makes for a good story. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.